Before we get into the video, I need to make something very clear. I suck at art. There is a reason why my wife is doing the art for our game Samurado. And I feel like it's important that this topic of discussion, how to make games when you suck at art, is discussed by someone who truly does suck at art. So to prove it to you, before making this video, I sat down to attempt to draw a character from my favorite game, Hollow Knight. This one is not mine. This is my daughter's. She's 10 and she wanted to draw it with me. And she took the time to add some graphical flair in there because I was really slow. I especially like that she added Hornet stabbing Grim in the head. This one is mine. So I hope this speaks volumes because I feel like I am sufficiently qualified to talk about sucking at art. My daughter gave me a 5 out of 10 for this, which I think is pretty generous. So what we're talking about is simply, how do you make a game that people will actually want to spend money on when you suck at art? And the reason I'm making this video is because if you go online and you try to find an answer to this question, a lot of what you're going to hear is essentially get better at art. You're going to hear practice, 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 draw something every day, learn about color theory, learn about composition, all of that stuff. And by the way, that is good advice if you want to be good at art a few years down the road. This video is for people who are working on a game right now, and it is for people who want to make progress on their game right now. I'm not saying don't practice, I'm not saying don't try to improve. Do those things, absolutely. But what we're talking about is in the meantime, while you are honing your skills, what can be done? So yes, you could outsource your art, meaning if you work alone, you could become a team of 2, or if you have some money to play with, you could hire one up front. And there are always assets that you can purchase for commercial use. Plus, there are a lot of free commercially available assets on websites like opengameart.org. And there are websites like Fiverr where you could hire for one-off jobs, like getting a main character or a few NPCs, that kind of thing. The obvious upside to this is you're paying for a shortcut, which means you get to keep making progress, and you end up having a game with decent-looking assets. And the obvious downside is the cost, or even having to work with somebody else. Maybe you like working alone. There's nothing wrong with that. And obviously this is the route that I took. My wife does our art. And we even purchased a few assets for our environment in our game as well. But I do know that for a lot of indie developers, the reality of the situation is you don't have the budget to hire an artist. It's not cheap. And not everyone wants to have to rely on assets for their game. So let's look at some other options. A lot of indie developers seem to flock to pixel art, and I have to assume that this is because it's either easier to learn or it just seems more approachable on the surface. I have no experience creating pixel art whatsoever, but I've heard arguments that are on both sides. Some people say it's easier, and some people actually say that it's harder. There are definitely more clearly defined rules and limitations with pixel art that someone like me would probably appreciate working with. But let's look at other things because honestly, unless you get really good at pixel art, it's not going to wow anyone. So let's talk about a minimalist design. And the best example I can think of here would actually be Jonas Tyroller's game Thronefall. It's beautiful, and yet it is absolutely bare bones minimal art. The number of colors is very limited. There are really bright colors that are contrasted by really dark shadows, and it looks really nice. Interestingly, another great example is another Jonas Tyroller game, Will You Snail. I don't know what to call this kind of art, so I'm just going to call it highly stylized. And he chose this art style because he said that he wasn't a particularly skilled artist. There's just lots of simple shapes, bloom, bright colors. It has a very digital vibe to it, which matches the theme of the game. It really pops. I think it's beautiful. You could choose a monochrome palette so that you don't have to worry about colors so much. Ben Bonk makes awesome devlogs on his game Slime Keep. This is his game you're seeing right now. Go to Steam and go wishlist it because it looks awesome. Now, another example I think many of you will be familiar with is Limbo. They make a great use of a monochrome palette. This game is dark and absolutely stunning. And here are a few other examples if you want to go check them out as well. Another game with a really interesting visual style is Ape Out. They use a lot of harsh textures on the environment and a very limited color palette, but every explosion and blood smear stands out really well. You could use abstract art. Your game could be centered around a lot of basic shapes like Geometry Wars or Thomas Was Alone. You might have to think outside the box a little bit, but you can have a very visually striking game without having years of drawing practice. Now, don't get me wrong, 3D modeling is a beast in its own right. However, there are some things that are really difficult to get right in a 2D game, like proper lighting and shading that are taken care of for you in a 3D game. Even if you're really dead set on making a 2D game, you can still combine 2D and 3D elements. Ori and the Blind Forest and Ori and the Will of the Wisps are some of my favorite games, and as far as I can tell, they definitely use 3D models for their characters. And I think it uses 2D art for a lot of the environment. Now, 3D's pixel art equivalent is the classic low poly look, which actually I think can be really charming looking. Equilinox by Thin Matrix is an extremely charming and I think very beautiful game, and it's really relaxing to play. And as you look at his game, you can actually tell none of these would have been difficult to animate either. It looks like he mostly used math to animate them rather than actually rigging bones into his characters and animating them. And actually, this is a good segue into my next section. If you suck at art, then shaders and post-processing are going to be your best friends. You can use shaders to stylize your entire game. The Zelda games for the Nintendo Switch use cell shading shaders. Borderlands uses this awesome toon outline on everything. Dead Cells actually used a 3D model for the character with a pixel art shader to give it its really unique and distinctive look. Sable used a crosshatch shader to get these really cool looking lines. Now, I do have to say again that learning shaders is a whole other beast in and of itself as well. I've been working with them for a long time, and I would maybe consider myself at the high end of beginner or possibly the low end of intermediate. But what you can accomplish even with a little bit of basic knowledge of shaders is absolutely astounding. I promise you, if you taught yourself how to code for game development, then you can learn shaders as well. So having a visually appealing game is one of the easiest ways to get people's attention, but it is not the be-all end-all for your whole game. Vampire Survivors is probably one of the ugliest games that I absolutely love. The animations are lifeless. There's no discernible color palette from what I can tell. It just kind of looks awful, and yet it is absolutely incredible to play. It's so much fun, and it went viral, no problem. Why? It's probably because the screen is constantly filled with mayhem, and it flips the bullet hell genre on its head by making you the bullet hell on your enemies instead. Terraria is wildly successful, and I happen to think it's an extremely ugly game, although I might be alone there, I'm not sure. Undertale, amazing game, wildly successful, very cute, also very ugly. Papers, Please has a very consistent art style that I find very unappealing to look at. By the way, I'm not trying to bash these games, not at all. It's actually the opposite, because every one of these games offers something really unique and really special. And gamers love these games, despite the fact that not all of them are the most visually appealing games in the world. So that leads me to this question. What are your strengths? Is it story, music, gameplay, design? Again, if you want to improve as an artist, then absolutely you have to practice. That's just the only way you're going to get better. But if you want to make an incredible game before taking years of practice to get good at art, there are ways to do it. Art might be one of your weaknesses, but you have strengths as well. Make sure that your strengths are the main pillars for your game, because players will notice. That's all I got, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.